Why can't I move my legs? I woke up to use the bathroom and my legs wouldn't move. They just hung off the bed like dead weight when I tried to stand. I told my husband I couldn't move my legs and he thought he was joking, but finally called 911 when I couldn't stop crying. The EMTs arrived within 10 minutes asking if I'd fallen or hit my head. I hadn't done anything. I'd gone to bed walking and woken up paralyzed. They did quick neurological tests in the ambulance and exchanged looks I didn't like. At the emergency room, they rushed me in for an MRI thinking spine injury or stroke. The neurologist came in with the results looking confused. "Your scan is completely normal," she said. "No spinal compression, no lesions, no nerve damage. Structurally, everything looks perfect." "Then why can't I move?" I asked. "We're going to run more tests," she said. They did blood work looking for infections or autoimmune disorders. They did nerve conduction studies that showed my nerves were working fine. They stuck needles in my legs for an EMG and the muscles responded normally to electrical stimulation. Every single test came back perfect. "The good news is we're not seeing any physical damage," the neurologist said on day 3. "How is that good news?" I asked. "I still can't walk." "Have you been under stress lately?" she asked. "Sometimes the body can manifest psychological stress in physical ways." "You think I'm making this up?" I said. "No, I'm saying that conversion disorder is a real condition where emotional trauma can cause physical symptoms," she said. "Your brain might be protecting you from something by shutting down your legs." "My brain is fine," I said. "I'm not traumatized. I just can't move." She suggested a psychiatric consultation, but I refused. She made notes in her chart that I could tell weren't favorable. The nurses started taking longer to respond to my call button after that. Mark brought my laptop so I could research on my own. I found dozens of stories of people with sudden paralysis who were told it was psychological when doctors couldn't find anything. Some of them spent years in wheelchairs before someone figured out what was really wrong. Others never got answers at all. A new doctor came by and asked about recent vaccinations or viral infections. I'd had a cold 3 weeks earlier, but nothing serious. He ordered different blood tests looking for rare antibodies. Those came back normal too, which seemed to personally offend him, like I was wasting his time. "We think you should try physical therapy," he said. "Sometimes if we can retrain the neural pathways, the function returns." "But you don't know why this happened," I said. "The body is mysterious," he said. "What matters is getting you walking again." The physical therapist was aggressively cheerful. She kept saying things like, "Let's see what we can do today," while manipulating my dead legs. She'd tell me to push against her hand, and then act surprised when nothing happened, like I wasn't trying hard enough. "I want you to visualize walking," she said. "Really see yourself standing up." "I'm paralyzed, not lacking imagination," I said. "Attitude is important for recovery," she said and made more notes. On day 5, a psychiatrist showed up even though I hadn't agreed to see one. He asked about my childhood and my marriage and whether I'd ever had anxiety. He used the phrase secondary gain, which meant he thought I was getting something out of being paralyzed. "What could I possibly gain from this?" I asked. "Sometimes we're not conscious of our motivations," he said. I told him to leave. Mark started asking if maybe I should try the antidepressants they were suggesting. Even he was starting to doubt me. I could see it in the way he'd test my legs when he thought I wasn't watching, dropping things on them to see if I'd react. On day 7, they said they were discharging me. Nothing was physically wrong, so insurance wouldn't cover more hospital days. They'd arranged for a wheelchair and outpatient therapy. The neurologist gave me pamphlets about conversion disorder and functional neurological symptoms. "So you're giving up," I said. "We've run every test," she said. "Sometimes the best thing is to go home and see if it resolves on its own." They wheeled me out and Mark drove me home in silence. He'd built a ramp to the front door and moved our bedroom to the ground floor. He'd accepted this was permanent or psychological or both. I was completely on my own now. That night, I was Googling desperately when I found a forum post from someone with my exact symptoms. The doctors had said it was psychological for 2 years. Then she'd paid for a specialized scan not covered by insurance, and they'd found inflammation in her spinal cord so small, the regular MRI had missed it. She'd been paralyzed for 2 years being told she was crazy when the answer had been right there. She could walk now after the right treatment. She'd posted the name of the doctor who'd finally believed her. I called his office with shaking hands. The receptionist said he was booked for months, but when I explained my situation, she said to hold. The doctor himself got on the line. "How long have you been paralyzed?" he asked. 7 days, I said. "Get here tomorrow," he said. "Bring all your scans. We might have a very small window to figure this out before permanent damage sets in." I hung up the phone and my hands were still shaking. Mark was already asleep in the bedroom downstairs, the one he'd moved us into because he thought this was permanent. I wheeled myself to the desk and started pulling out every piece of paper from the hospital stay. Discharge instructions went in one pile, test results in another. The pamphlets about conversion disorder went straight in the trash. My hands kept trembling as I tried to organize everything, but I couldn't stop moving because if I stopped, I'd start thinking about what permanent damage meant. The radiologist reports all said the same thing. Normal, normal, normal. Like they were mocking me. I found the business card from the neurologist who'd suggested the psychiatrist and I tore it in half. Then I found the EMG results and the nerve conduction studies, and I put those in a folder labeled proof even though they'd proved nothing. The clock on the wall said it was past midnight, but I kept going through papers. making sure I had copies of everything. Mark's insurance card, my ID, the list of medications they'd sent me home with, even though none of them were actually treating anything. I made a checklist on a notepad of what I needed to bring tomorrow. Medical records, insurance information, the name of every test they'd run, the dates of every symptom. By the time I finished organizing, it was almost 2 in the morning and my eyes were burning, but at least I had something concrete to show this new doctor. At 6, I wheeled into the bedroom and shook Mark's shoulder. He opened his eyes looking confused, and I told him we were driving 3 hours to the specialist today. We needed to leave by 7. He sat up and started to say something about work, and whether this was really necessary. Another doctor when we'd already seen so many. I just looked at him, and whatever he saw in my face made him stop talking. He nodded and got out of bed and went to get dressed without another word. I heard him in the bathroom and then making coffee in the kitchen while I got myself ready, which took twice as long as it used to because everything required planning now. By 6:45, we were loading my wheelchair into the car along with the folder of documents and a cooler of snacks because I didn't know how long this would take. At 8 o'clock exactly, I called the first hospital's medical records department from the car while Mark drove. The clerk who answered sounded bored, and I explained I needed my MRI images on a CD immediately. I had an appointment with a specialist today. She told me it takes 3 business days to process records requests, and I'd need to fill out a release form. I actually started crying on the phone. Not fake crying, but real tears because I couldn't take one more person telling me to wait. I told her I'd been paralyzed for 8 days and nobody could tell me why, and I needed those images today, or I might have permanent nerve damage. There was a long silence, and then she said, if someone could pick it up by noon, she'd have it ready. Just come to the records office on the 2nd floor. I thanked her about 5 times and gave her my information, and then Mark had to pull over at a gas station so I could use the bathroom. The drive was the most humiliating 3 hours of my life. We had to stop twice for bathroom breaks, and each time Mark had to physically carry me into the women's room because not every rest stop had accessible stalls. The first time he tried to be gentle about it, but by the 2nd stop he was just lifting me like a piece of furniture. I could see him struggling with something while he carried me, his face doing that thing where he was trying to figure out if this was real or if I was somehow doing this to myself. I was too exhausted to care what he thought anymore. I just focused on getting through each moment, getting to this doctor who'd said to come immediately. We stopped at the first hospital at 11:30, and Mark ran in to get the CD while I waited in the car. He came back 10 minutes later with a thin envelope and we kept driving. The specialist's office was in a medical building near a university hospital. Mark got my wheelchair out and I transferred into it, and we went up to the 3rd floor. The intake nurse called me back at exactly 1:15, and Mark stayed in the waiting room. She led me to an exam room and spent the next 45 minutes taking my history, and for the first time since this started, someone wrote down every single detail without that look. You know the look. The one that says they think you're exaggerating or confused or making it up. She asked about the cold I'd had 3 weeks ago. What day exactly did it start? What were my symptoms? When did they resolve? She made notes when I described waking up paralyzed, how sudden it was, how my legs had just been dead weight. She asked about the hospital tests and wrote down every normal result, nodding like normal results meant something important instead of meaning I was wasting everyone's time. When I mentioned how the other doctors had treated me, she just kept writing. No judgment on her face at all. Then Dr. Holloway came in, and I knew immediately this was different. She examined me with complete focus, testing my reflexes with a little hammer and running something sharp along the bottom of my feet to check sensation. She explained what she was checking for with each test, not talking down to me but actually teaching me about my own body. She had me try to move my legs in different ways, and she measured how much I could do, writing everything down in specific terms instead of just, patient reports weakness. When I told her about the conversion disorder diagnosis and the psychiatrist who'd used the phrase secondary gain, she stopped writing and looked right at me. She said she believed something physical was happening to me, that my symptoms were real and we were going to figure out what was causing them. I actually started sobbing, just completely broke down crying in the exam room because someone finally believed me. She handed me tissues and waited until I could breathe again. She explained I might have something called transverse myelitis, which is inflammation in the spinal cord. It can be subtle enough to hide on regular scans, but serious enough to cause real paralysis, exactly what I was experiencing. Or it could be another inflammatory condition. There were several possibilities we needed to rule out. The validation felt like oxygen after drowning, like I could finally breathe after 8 days of being told I was crazy. But she was very clear this was still a working theory. We needed proof before we could start treatment. She needed to see my MRI images and probably do more testing. I gave her the CD from the hospital and she said she'd review it carefully with a colleague who specialized in reading these scans. Dr. Holloway pulled up a stool and sat down so we were at eye level. She told me she wanted to do a high-resolution MRI, something called a 3T MRI, with contrast that could pick up inflammation the regular scan might have missed. She also mentioned possibly doing a spinal tap to check for antibodies and signs of inflammation in my spinal fluid. She warned me these tests were expensive and invasive. The spinal tap especially could be uncomfortable and insurance might fight covering them. But they were time-sensitive because if there was inflammation, we needed to catch it before permanent nerve damage set in. She said we might only have weeks, not months, to figure this out and start treatment. I told her to order whatever tests she needed. I didn't care about the cost or the insurance. I just needed answers. She nodded and started making notes about what to schedule first. The next morning, I was on the phone with my insurance company at 8 when they opened. I'd barely slept because my mind kept racing through everything Dr. Holloway had said, finally having hope mixed with fear about the time pressure. The insurance representative asked for my member ID and date of birth, and then I explained I needed pre-authorization for a 3T MRI with contrast. She pulled up my records and I could hear her typing. Then she said I'd just had an MRI 8 days ago that was normal, so why did I need another one? I tried to explain about the specialist and the possibility of subtle inflammation, and how the regular MRI might have missed something important. She kept saying if the first scan was normal, there was no medical necessity for a second one. I spent 2 hours on that phone call, getting transferred to different departments, explaining my symptoms over and over, trying not to scream into the phone. Finally, someone said they'd review the request, and I'd hear back in 5 to 7 business days. I asked what I was supposed to do if permanent damage set in while they were reviewing, and she said that was between me and my doctor. That afternoon, Dr. Holloway called me herself. She said she'd personally called Duncan, a neuroradiologist she trusted, and they'd reviewed my original MRI together on his high-resolution monitors. I sat by the phone feeling my heart pound, terrified they'd find nothing again, and this would be another dead end. But Dr. Holloway said Duncan thought he might see something questionable in my thoracic spine, a very faint area that could be inflammation or could be normal variation. It wasn't definitive enough to diagnose anything, but it was enough to justify the better imaging. She said she'd submit a peer-to-peer review with my insurance company, which meant she'd talk directly to their medical reviewer and explain why this test was necessary. She told me to sit tight and she'd fight for the authorization. After we hung up, I just sat there holding the phone, feeling something I hadn't felt in over a week. Not quite hope, but maybe the possibility of hope. Like there might actually be an answer somewhere if we could just find it. 2 days later, I was back in Dr. Holloway's exam room for another complete neurological check. She spent over an hour this time, not rushing through anything like the hospital doctors had done. She tested my reflexes with the little hammer, tapping different spots on my knees and ankles and elbows while writing down numbers I didn't understand. She had me try to move each toe separately while she watched and made marks on a chart. She used a pin to test sensation, asking me to say when I felt sharp versus dull, and I could tell she was mapping out exactly where my feeling changed. She measured the distance I could lift each leg, which was basically nothing, but she wrote it all down with exact numbers. She checked my muscle tone by moving my legs in different directions and feeling how much resistance there was. When she finished, she had pages of documentation with grades and measurements, real proof that my body wasn't working right. Having it all written down in official medical language felt important, like building evidence for a case nobody believed yet. She made copies of everything from my records, and said this would help justify the advanced imaging to insurance. The whole exam made me feel taken seriously in a way the hospital never had, like my symptoms mattered enough to measure carefully. After the exam, we scheduled the 3T MRI for 2 days out, which felt both too soon and not soon enough. Dr. Holloway explained I'd need to lie completely still in the tube for 90 minutes while they got the detailed images. She asked if I needed sedation because anxiety could cause movement that would blur the scan. I said I'd be fine because I was scared sedation might somehow affect the results, but she made me promise to call if I changed my mind. She was thinking ahead about every detail that could go wrong, planning for problems before they happened. She gave me written instructions about not eating for 4 hours before and drinking extra water and removing all metal. The appointment card felt like the most important thing I'd ever held. On the drive home, Mark brought up the conversion disorder diagnosis again. He asked if maybe stress from work or something could be causing some of this, his voice careful like he was trying not to upset me. I told him if he mentioned psychology one more time, he could sleep in the guest room. He went quiet and we didn't talk the rest of the 3-hour drive back. The silence felt heavy and angry, filling up the car until I wanted to scream. I stared out the window watching the highway blur past and thought about how alone I was even sitting right next to him. When we got home, I went straight to the bedroom and shut the door. I spent the evening preparing for the scan like it was the most important test of my life. I set 3 alarms on my phone for the early morning appointment. I laid out clothes with no metal, checking the tags and seams twice. I filled up 2 water bottles and put them in the fridge. I read through the instruction sheet 5 times until I had it memorized. Mark helped me figure out transportation logistics without saying much, looking up the address and calculating drive time and where to the park. The silence between us felt like another person in the room, something solid and cold taking up space. He asked if I needed him to come in with me, and I said no. I could handle it alone. The scan day came, and the 90 minutes in the machine felt endless. The tube was smaller than I expected, and the noise was so loud even with earplugs. I focused on staying perfectly still, not even swallowing unless I absolutely had to, terrified any movement would ruin everything. My back ached from lying flat, but I didn't shift position. When they finally pulled me out, I was shaking and sweating, and my heart was pounding. Dr. Holloway called 3 days later with the results. She said the 3T MRI showed a faint area of questionable signal in my thoracic spine that might be inflammation. But it wasn't clear enough or big enough to confirm anything for sure. She used the word suspicious but not diagnostic, which meant we still didn't have proof. I was stuck in terrible limbo between vindication and continued doubt, between something being wrong and nothing showing up. She said it was enough to justify more testing, but not enough to start treatment yet. I wanted to scream because how could something be there but not really there? How could I be paralyzed but the scans still be mostly normal? 2 days later, an envelope came from the insurance company. Inside was a denial letter for the MRI I'd already had. They said it wasn't medically necessary since my first scan at the hospital had been normal. The bill was $12,000. I sat there holding the letter and actually started laughing at how absurd it all was. This horrible joke where I couldn't walk and now owed more money than I had. Then I was crying instead of laughing. Big, ugly sobs that made my whole body shake. Mark found me on the couch still holding the letter. That afternoon, Dr. Holloway called and said she was connecting me with someone who could help. Her name was Rowan Vasquez, and she was a patient advocate who specialized in insurance appeals. Dr. Holloway gave me Rowan's number and said to call her right away. I called and Rowan answered on the second ring. She asked me to email her all my documents and said she'd start working on it immediately. 2 hours later, she called back and said she'd already drafted an appeal letter explaining why the advanced imaging had been essential. Her voice was calm and confident, and she talked about the appeal process like it was something she did every day, which I guess it was. Having someone who knew what they were doing and believed me made me feel less alone than I had in weeks. That night, Mark and I had the worst fight we'd ever had. He was looking at our bank statements and the medical bills piling up. He said we couldn't afford to keep chasing expensive tests for something doctors couldn't find. He said maybe we should consider that stress could manifest physically, that the first hospital might have been right. I told him I'd rather be broke than paralyzed and gaslit for the rest of my life. I said if he didn't believe me, then what was the point of being married? He said he was just trying to be realistic about money. We yelled until our voices were hoarse and then stopped talking completely. He slept in the guest room. The next day, Dr. Holloway called with a new plan. She wanted to start me on high-dose steroids while we waited for approval to do a lumbar puncture. The steroids might reduce inflammation if that was what was causing my paralysis, but they wouldn't prove anything diagnostically. She explained the side effects, mood changes and insomnia and nausea and weight gain. I said I didn't care. I'd try anything. She scheduled me for the first infusion 2 days later at an outpatient center. The first steroid infusion happened in a room with other people getting various treatments through IVs. The nurse hung the bag and started it running into my arm. Within 2 hours, I felt jittery and weird, my heart racing like I'd had too much coffee. My hands started trembling and I felt nauseous. By that evening, I was a mess, unable to sit still but too tired to do anything. My heart kept pounding and I felt sick to my stomach. I lay awake all night feeling wired and miserable, staring at the ceiling and wondering if I was trading one kind of suffering for another. Mark checked on me once, but I pretended to be asleep because I didn't want to talk to him. The jittery feeling from the steroids kept me wired until maybe 4 in the morning when I finally dozed off for an hour. When I opened my eyes, the sun was coming through the window and my heart was still racing from the medication. I shifted in bed trying to get comfortable, and that's when it happened. My left thigh twitched. Just once, a tiny flutter under the skin that lasted maybe half a second. I froze completely and stared down at my legs, willing it to happen again. Nothing. I pressed my hand against the spot where I'd felt it and waited. Still nothing. Maybe I'd imagined it, or maybe it was just a random muscle spasm that didn't mean anything at all. I was terrified to hope because what if I got my hopes up and it turned out to be nothing? I grabbed my phone and almost texted Dr. Holloway, but then stopped myself because one twitch wasn't proof of anything. I spent the rest of the morning obsessing over my legs and trying to make them twitch again through sheer willpower. 3 days later, I was back at the hospital for the lumbar puncture. They had me sit on the edge of the exam table and curl forward over a pillow, while a doctor I'd never met before felt along my spine looking for the right spot. The nurse kept telling me to stay very still and breathe normally, but my whole body was tense. When the needle went in, I felt this sharp stabbing pain that made me gasp and grab the nurse's hand. The doctor said I was doing great, but the pressure in my spine was horrible and wrong in a way I can't describe. It felt like someone was drilling into my back, and I could feel the needle moving deeper, and I wanted to scream. The whole procedure took maybe 15 minutes, but it felt like hours. Afterward, they made me lie flat on my back and said I needed to stay horizontal for a few hours to prevent a spinal headache. Within an hour, my head started pounding anyway, this crushing pressure that got worse every time I tried to sit up even a little. I threw up twice into a basin the nurse brought, and the movement made my head hurt. So bad I saw spots. They kept me overnight, and I spent 2 days after that lying completely flat in bed at home, wondering if I'd made a huge mistake letting them do this. Dr. Holloway called me while I was still lying flat and said she wanted to video conference with a colleague who knew about rare inflammatory conditions. I said yes, and she scheduled it for the next afternoon. When the call connected, I could see Dr. Holloway in her office and another doctor in what looked like a different clinic. They talked about my case like I wasn't there at first, discussing the timeline and my symptoms and the imaging results. The other doctor asked about my reflexes and whether I'd had any infections recently. Requested Reds is on Spotify now. Check out link in the description or comments. Dr. Holloway pulled up my scans on her computer, and they both leaned in looking at something I couldn't see. They used words I didn't understand, but their tone was engaged and curious, like they were working on a puzzle they actually wanted to solve. It helped somehow, knowing she wasn't just giving up or passing me off. When they were included me in the conversation, the other doctor said my presentation was unusual but not impossible, and they should keep investigating. After the call ended, I felt less alone than I had in days. I pulled up the forum where I'd found the original post and sent a message to the woman who'd written about her misdiagnosis. I explained my situation and asked if she'd be willing to share more details. She responded within a few hours and attached scans and a detailed timeline of her symptoms. Seeing her documentation laid out like that, the 2 years of being told it was psychological before someone finally found the inflammation, gave me something concrete to hold on to. She wrote that she wished someone had believed her sooner, and she hoped I'd get answers faster than she did. I saved all her files to show Dr. Holloway and added them to my growing folder of research. Dr. Holloway called again a few days later and said she wanted to order specialized blood tests for something called MOG and AQP4 antibodies that could show specific autoimmune problems. She warned me the tests would cost around $3,000 and might not be covered by insurance. I felt my stomach drop at the number, but I said to do it anyway because what choice did I have? She said she'd send the orders and I should call Rowan to add this to the appeal packet. I called Rowan right after and she answered on the first ring like always. She made notes about the new tests and said she'd update the appeal with medical necessity documentation. Her calm efficiency made the cost feel slightly less scary. My HR department called the next morning asking about leave paperwork and short-term disability applications. I'd been so focused on getting a diagnosis that I hadn't dealt with the fact that I couldn't work anymore. The HR person walked me through forms and deadlines and said I needed documentation from Dr. Holloway about my limitations. I realized this was going to be a whole second job just managing the paperwork side of being sick. After I hung up, I spent 2 hours filling out forms online and gathering pay stubs and medical records. Every question wanted dates and details and doctors' names, and I had to keep stopping to look things up. Rowan and I scheduled a video call to work on the appeal packet together. She had a template already set up, and we spent the afternoon going through it section by section. She needed medical necessity letters from Dr. Holloway, research articles about inflammatory conditions, and documentation showing how my function had declined. I had to dig through my phone for photos Mark had taken of me trying to stand in the hospital, and videos the physical therapist had recorded. Putting it all together was boring and tedious, but having specific tasks to complete made me feel less helpless. Rowan knew exactly what the insurance company would want to see and how to frame everything. By the end of the call, we had a solid packet ready to submit. Mark started helping with bed transfers and bathroom needs without me asking him to do it. He'd just appear when I needed to move and position himself to support my weight. We figured out a system where he'd count to 3 and then lift while I tried to help as much as I could. It was awkward and neither of us talked much during these moments, but it worked. He never apologized for doubting me earlier, but his actions showed he was trying now. I was too tired and too focused on getting through each day to demand words from him. The functional system we developed was enough for now. The second steroid infusion happened a week after the first one, and this time was different. About an hour after they started the IV, I felt this burning sensation in my legs, like they were on fire from the inside. It was horrible because my legs were still paralyzed, but somehow I could feel this intense burning pain in them. I called the nurse and she paged Dr. Holloway, who came by within the hour. Dr. Holloway examined me and adjusted my medications, then explained this nerve pain might actually be a sign of the nerves waking up. She said she couldn't promise anything, but sometimes pain meant the pathways were trying to reconnect. The burning continued for days, and I had to take new medication just to sleep through it. The rehab facility called to schedule my evaluation, and I met Maya for the first time. She was younger than I expected and had this direct way of talking that I liked immediately. She did a full assessment, measuring my range of motion and testing what I could and couldn't do. Then she sat down with me and created goals focused on preventing my muscles from wasting away and keeping my joints moving. She never once suggested I should be able to do more than I could, or acted like my limitations weren't real. She treated my effort as actual work, and my struggles as legitimate problems to solve. When she explained the plan she'd created, I felt tears starting because someone finally saw this as real physical therapy for a real physical problem. She scheduled me for twice-weekly sessions and gave me exercises to do at home, writing everything down in detail so I wouldn't forget. The insurance denial letter arrived 4 days later in a thin envelope that I knew was bad news before I even opened it. I read through the bureaucratic language twice, trying to understand what they were actually saying, and it came down to a technicality about pre-authorization timing. They claimed the test should have been approved before it happened, even though Dr. Holloway had ordered it urgently, because she thought I might have permanent nerve damage. The letter made it sound like we'd broken some rule on purpose instead of trying to figure out why I couldn't walk. I sat there staring at the paper feeling completely defeated, because how was I supposed to fight this when I could barely get myself to the bathroom? I called Rowan and she answered on the second ring. She listened while I read the denial letter out loud, and then explained we could file a state-level grievance that went above the insurance company's internal review. Her voice was calm and matter-of-fact, like this was annoying but not surprising, and somehow that pulled me back from the edge of giving up entirely. She said to send her the denial letter, and she'd start drafting the grievance paperwork today. The next morning, Rowan emailed me a detailed list of everything she needed for the state grievance packet. I spent 3 hours gathering additional documentation, printing out research articles about transverse myelitis and similar conditions, organizing my medical records into a timeline that showed how fast everything had happened. Having specific tasks to complete kept me focused instead of spiraling into panic about the $12,000 bill. Rowan explained these fights usually took months, but we had a strong case because Dr. Holloway's medical necessity letter was thorough, and the timing issue was debatable. She drafted the grievance while I assembled supporting documents, and by the end of the day, we had everything ready to submit. 2 weeks after my first appointment with Dr. Holloway, I went back for a follow-up exam. She did the same neurological tests as before, tapping my knees with the reflex hammer and running that sharp wheel up and down my legs. She measured my responses and compared them to her notes from the first visit, then sat back looking thoughtful. My right knee reflex was slightly different, maybe a bit stronger, or maybe just normal variation. She explained that learning to live with words like might be and possibly was its own kind of work, that we rarely got the clear answers people wanted in cases like mine. The uncertainty felt heavy, but I was starting to understand this was how it would be for a while. I woke up one morning and realized immediately something was wrong. The sheets were wet and cold, and the smell told me what had happened before my brain fully processed it. I'd lost bowel control during the night and hadn't even felt it happening. The shame was so complete I couldn't even cry. Just lay there frozen trying to figure out how to deal with this. Mark woke up and understood the situation without me saying anything. He got up and started running the shower without comment, then came back and helped me transfer to the wheelchair. We didn't talk while he stripped the bed and helped me clean up in the shower. His face was focused and practical, like this was just another problem to solve. After I was dressed in clean clothes, I called Dr. Holloway's office and left a message with the nurse about this new symptom. Dr. Holloway called back within 2 hours and asked specific questions about timing and whether I'd had any warning sensations. She adjusted my medications to address the bowel issues and set up a remote monitoring system so I could report symptoms without having to come to the emergency room every time something changed. Her quick response and practical problem-solving approach made me trust her even more because she treated each new problem as something to manage instead of evidence I was failing. The external insurance review paperwork arrived and I filled it out carefully, making sure every section was complete. The timeline said the review would take several more weeks and there was nothing I could do to speed it up. I was learning that medical bureaucracy moved at its own pace no matter how urgent my situation felt, and getting angry about it just wasted energy I didn't have. Mark came home one afternoon with grab bars and a shower chair still in their boxes. He wanted to install them right away to prevent falls, but I argued that I needed to maintain some independence and the equipment made everything feel so permanent. We went back and forth about it for 20 minutes, me insisting I could manage and him pointing out I'd already fallen twice trying to transfer from the wheelchair. Eventually, I agreed to let him install the equipment because safety mattered more than my pride, even though accepting that felt like giving up something important. The third steroid infusion happened 3 weeks after the first one, and this time something was different. About halfway through the fourth, I felt a weird sensation in my right leg. Not quite tingling, but something. I stared down at my foot and concentrated hard, trying to make my toes move. Nothing happened at first, but then my big toe twitched slightly. I did it again, and the toe moved a tiny bit, maybe a centimeter. I called the nurse over, and she paged Maya, who came up to document what was happening. Maya tested my toe movement officially, measuring the range and strength, and wrote everything down in her notes with the exact time and date. She told me not to get too excited yet because recovery wasn't always linear, but I could see she was pleased. I let myself feel cautious hope for the first time since this started. Duncan reviewed my MRI scans again with fresh eyes, going through each slice slowly on his computer. He called Dr. Holloway and asked her to come look at something. When she called me later that day, she explained Duncan had identified a faint area of increased signal on the T2 images that he'd initially missed because it was so subtle. Having concrete imaging evidence felt like proof I wasn't crazy, even though we still didn't know exactly what it meant or how to treat it. At my next appointment, Dr. Holloway started using the phrase probable transverse myelitis in her notes. She explained it was the best working diagnosis even without perfect confirmation from all the tests. The antibody tests had been negative and the spinal tap hadn't shown clear inflammation, but the pattern of my symptoms, plus the subtle imaging findings, plus the response to steroids all pointed towards some kind of inflammatory condition affecting my spinal cord. Having a name for this made it feel more real and less like something I was imagining or causing myself, even though probable meant we still weren't completely certain. That night, Mark came into the bedroom where I was sitting up with my laptop and he pulled the chair close to the bed. He looked tired and older than I remembered him looking before all this started. He said he was sorry for doubting me, and that he'd been scared out of his mind watching me lose the ability to walk. He admitted he didn't know how to handle that kind of fear, so he'd convinced himself it might be psychological because that felt fixable somehow. It wasn't a perfect apology, and he didn't take back every hurtful thing he'd said or done, but I could tell he meant it. Something in my chest that had been tight for weeks loosened just a little bit. I told him I understood being scared, but I'd needed him to believe me when nobody else would. He nodded and reached for my hand, and we sat there for a while, not saying much else. The next morning, Rowan called with news about the insurance appeal. They'd partially approved it retroactively, which meant they would cover the cost of the 3T MRI I'd already had. She explained there were restrictions on future imaging, and they weren't agreeing to pay for everything, but getting $12,000 covered was significant progress. I could hear the satisfaction in her voice, like she'd won a battle she'd been expecting to lose. She told me to keep all the documentation because we might need it for future appeals. I thanked her about 5 times, and she laughed and said this was literally her job. After we hung up, I felt like I could breathe a little easier knowing that one massive bill wasn't hanging over us anymore. That afternoon, I joined a virtual support group for people with transverse myelitis and related spinal conditions that someone on the forum had recommended. I logged into the video call feeling awkward about seeing strangers' faces while sitting in my wheelchair, but everyone else was dealing with similar stuff. One woman talked about managing bowel issues, and I realized I wasn't the only person dealing with that humiliation. A guy described the burning nerve pain he'd had during recovery, and it sounded exactly like what I was experiencing. Someone else recommended a specific type of ankle-foot orthotic brace that had helped them walk more safely during their recovery. Hearing practical strategies from people who'd actually been through this helped more than any therapy session with someone who'd only read about it in textbooks. I ordered the brace online that night and felt like I'd found my people. Maya introduced a standing frame during my next PT session, this big metal contraption that would let me practice bearing weight on my legs with full support. She explained we needed to get my bones and muscles used to being vertical again, even if I couldn't walk yet. The first time she helped me transfer into it and slowly tilted me upright, I felt panic rush through my whole body. I hadn't been fully vertical in weeks, and my legs were shaking hard trying to hold even a fraction of my weight. Maya kept one hand on my shoulder and talked me through breathing slowly. My legs felt like they might give out completely, but they were holding some weight, and that was something. I was terrified and proud at the same time, standing there gripping the frame handles with white knuckles. Dr. Holloway called 2 days later with results from the MOG and AQP4 antibody tests. Both came back negative, which ruled out specific autoimmune causes like neuromyelitis optica. She said this was frustrating because we still didn't have a definitive answer about what caused my paralysis, but it didn't change our treatment approach. The diagnosis stayed as probable idiopathic transverse myelitis, meaning inflammation of unknown origin. I asked if we'd ever know for sure what happened, and she said maybe not, that sometimes medicine doesn't give us perfect answers. She reminded me that what mattered was that I was responding to treatment and showing some improvement. It wasn't the certainty I wanted, but I was learning to live with probable and idiopathic and all the other words that meant we were doing our best with incomplete information. At my next appointment, Dr. Holloway brought up plasmapheresis as a potential next treatment step. She explained it was a process where they'd filter antibodies out of my blood using a machine, basically cleaning out anything that might be attacking my spinal cord. It required placing a central line in my chest, and I'd need multiple sessions over several weeks. The whole thing sounded intense and kind of scary. She was honest that we were moving into more aggressive territory and there were risks like infection and blood pressure problems. I asked if she thought I needed it, and she said my recovery had stalled a bit, and this might help push things forward. The decision felt heavy sitting there in her office. Mark was with me, and he asked questions about success rates and complications. We told her we needed to think about it, and she said that was fine, but sooner was better than later if we decided to do it. Scheduling the central line placement turned into a whole complicated thing. Mark had to coordinate with his work to take time off for the procedure and the first few plasmapheresis sessions. Then we realized we needed someone to watch the house and handle stuff we normally did because I'd be pretty out of it after treatments. We didn't have kids, but we had a dog and plants and all these normal life things that suddenly became problems when you're dealing with medical procedures. Every decision about my health created this cascade of practical issues I hadn't anticipated. Mark made spreadsheets tracking his vacation days, and we figured out which neighbors could help with what. It felt ridiculous that getting treatment required this much logistical planning. The first plasmapheresis session happened on a Thursday morning at the hospital. They had me lie back in this big recliner chair in a room with several other people getting various infusions. The nurse accessed my central line and hooked me up to the machine that would cycle my blood through filters for the next 3 hours. I watched my blood go out through one tube, pass through this device, and come back through another tube. It was weird seeing my own blood outside my body like that. Mark sat next to me reading a book and occasionally looking up to check if I was okay. By the end, I felt completely drained, like someone had pulled the plug on my energy. They unhooked me and gave me instructions about watching for complications. I slept in the car on the way home and then slept for 14 more hours straight. When I finally woke up the next afternoon, I felt wrung out and hollow. During my PT session the following week, Maya was working on ankle mobility when she stopped and stared at my right foot. She asked me to try pulling my toes up toward my shin, the movement called dorsiflexion that I hadn't been able to do since this started. I concentrated hard, and my toes moved up slightly, maybe half an inch. Maya grabbed her measurement tools and documented the range of motion, then took photos for my chart. She measured it as 5 degrees of dorsiflexion. which doesn't sound like much, but it was 5 degrees more than zero. This was objective improvement she could document with numbers and evidence. I didn't let myself get too excited because I'd learned that recovery wasn't straightforward, but I did let myself feel a little more hope than I had before. Maya wrote everything down carefully with the exact date and time like she was building a case. 2 days after that, Rowan called about the external review results. The insurance company had approved limited additional treatments and a set number of rehabilitation hours. It wasn't unlimited coverage, and there were still caps on what they'd pay for, but it gave us a framework to work within. She explained the approval covered 8 more plasmapheresis sessions and 12 weeks of PT with specific goals we'd need to meet. It wasn't everything we'd asked for, but it was enough to keep making progress. I felt relief wash over me because at least we had a path forward now with some financial certainty. Rowan said to use the approved hours wisely and keep documenting everything in case we needed to appeal again later. I thanked her, and she reminded me this was what she did, helping people fight these battles so they could focus on getting better. I spent the next 2 days gathering every piece of documentation from the first hospital while Rowan drafted the formal complaint. We sat at my kitchen table with papers spread everywhere, building a timeline of how they dismissed my symptoms and pushed the conversion disorder diagnosis without proper investigation. Rowan showed me how to reference specific medical records and highlight the gaps in their diagnostic process. She explained the complaint might not result in any real consequences, but creating an official record mattered, especially if other patients experienced similar dismissal. I signed the forms, and Rowan filed them electronically with the state medical board and the hospital's patient relations department. The next week, Mark came with me to my appointment with Dr. Holloway, sitting quietly while she reviewed my latest test results and explained the diagnostic complexity. She walked through why transverse myelitis was so hard to catch on standard imaging, showing Mark the subtle signal changes on the advanced MRI that Duncan had identified. She described how inflammation could be microscopic, but still cause complete paralysis, and how the timing of symptoms made this different from psychological conditions. I watched Mark's face as he listened, seeing him finally understand why this had taken so long to figure out and why the first hospital's approach had been inadequate. On the drive home, he apologized again, this time with more understanding of what I'd been fighting against. Dr. Holloway and Maya worked together to create a home PT plan with specific exercises I could do daily without needing to travel to the clinic. Maya came to our house and showed Mark how to assist with the exercises, demonstrating proper support techniques and safety precautions. She gave me printed sheets with illustrations and set up weekly video check-ins to monitor my progress. Having a structured routine felt like taking back control when so much of my life still felt beyond my grasp. During one of these check-ins, Dr. Holloway talked about realistic recovery timelines, explaining some people with transverse myelitis regained full function, while others plateaued with permanent deficits. She said I should expect 3 to 6 months of intensive rehabilitation, and that my progress in the first few weeks was encouraging, but not predictive. Her honesty was hard to hear because I wanted guarantees, but I appreciated that she wasn't giving me false hope or making promises she couldn't keep. 2 weeks after starting the home exercises, Maya had me come back to the clinic to try walking with a walker. She positioned the device in front of me and stood close with her hands ready to catch me if I fell. I gripped the handles and managed to shuffle forward maybe 15 feet before my legs started shaking too badly to continue. The effort left me crying. Not from happiness or triumph, but from the overwhelming emotional release of moving under my own power after weeks of paralysis. Maya documented the distance and took notes about my gait pattern and endurance. The steroids were making me irritable and weepy beyond what seemed normal, my moods swinging wildly throughout the day. Dr. Holloway recommended a psychologist who specialized in helping people cope with medication side effects and medical trauma. I was nervous about seeing any mental health professional after the first hospital's approach, but this psychologist never suggested my original paralysis was psychological. She focused entirely on helping me develop strategies for managing the steroid effects and processing the trauma of being dismissed and gaslit by medical professionals. 3 weeks after filing the complaint, the first hospital sent a generic response denying any wrongdoing and defending their diagnostic approach as appropriate given the available information. I felt my stomach drop reading their dismissive language, but Rowan had warned me this was typical. We filed an appeal with more detailed documentation, including Dr. Holloway's notes about the delayed diagnosis and the specialized testing that finally identified the problem. Rowan said hospitals rarely admitted fault in initial responses, and we needed to keep pushing through their bureaucratic layers. My employer approved part-time remote work with accommodations, and I started logging back in for 4-hour shifts. The normalcy of doing my actual job again felt like reclaiming part of myself that had been lost in the medical chaos. I was completely exhausted after those 4 hours, and needed to nap immediately, but I felt proud that I could contribute something again beyond just managing my illness. My sister called about a family gathering coming up at a restaurant with steps at the entrance and no accessible bathroom. I had to decide whether to attend, knowing I'd need help getting inside, and people would ask questions about my wheelchair and recovery. After thinking it through, I told her I was skipping this one and setting that boundary without apologizing or feeling guilty about prioritizing my physical needs. 2 months after the initial complaint filing the appeal process, resulted in a response acknowledging that communication could have been better and announcing some modest policy changes about how they approached functional neurological diagnoses. It wasn't the accountability I wanted, no admission that they'd been wrong or apology for the harm caused, but it was something tangible. Rowan said even small policy changes could help future patients avoid what I'd experienced, and that perspective helped me accept the limited outcome. 3 months after waking up paralyzed, I walked 30 meters across Maya's clinic using my cane while she counted my steps and watched my gait pattern. My right leg still dragged slightly and my left foot turned inward when I got tired, but I made it the full distance without stopping. Maya measured it officially and wrote the number in my chart, looking genuinely pleased. She had me try walking on the textured mat they use to simulate uneven ground, and I made it maybe 10 steps before my ankle wobbled, and I had to grab the parallel bars. Maya nodded like she expected that and said we needed to focus on safety strategies and building endurance on flat surfaces before pushing outdoor terrain. She adjusted my goals to include longer distances indoors and practicing weight shifts to improve balance rather than trying to rush back to normal walking. Having someone acknowledge real progress while being honest about ongoing limitations felt validating in a way the first hospital's cheerleading never had. Mark and I sat in the couples therapist's office the following week in chairs positioned at an angle so we had to turn slightly to face each other. The therapist asked us each to describe what the early weeks after my paralysis had been like, and I talked about feeling abandoned when Mark doubted me. Mark's voice got tight when he said he'd been terrified I was dying or permanently disabled and he didn't know how to handle that fear, so he'd looked for explanations that felt less scary. The therapist pointed out we'd both experienced trauma through this situation just from completely different positions. I'd been traumatized by medical dismissal and physical helplessness, while Mark had been traumatized by watching his wife suffer and feeling powerless to help or understand what was happening. She said rebuilding trust meant acknowledging we'd both been hurt and both made mistakes under extreme stress. Mark reached over and took my hand during that session, and I didn't pull away, even though part of me still felt angry about those early weeks of doubt. I'm living now with a working diagnosis of probable idiopathic transverse myelitis and ongoing rehab appointments twice weekly. Some mornings I wake up and can walk to the bathroom with just a slight limp and feel almost normal. Other mornings my legs are weak and uncooperative and I need the wheelchair to get through the day safely. I've stopped expecting linear progress or waiting for the day when everything goes back to how it was before. Dr. Holloway still doesn't have perfect answers about why this happened to me and probably never will. The inflammation in my spine was too subtle to catch early, and by the time we found it, the damage was already done. I'm learning to be okay with uncertainty and with the reality that my body might never be predictable again. Recovery isn't a straight line from paralyzed to walking, and some days managing my limitations feels harder than others, but I'm still here and still moving forward. So yeah, that's the story. Nothing too dramatic, just how it went down. Thanks for hanging out. It honestly feels like catching up with a friend. Swing by again if you feel like it.